Scammers use deceptive tactics to do what? To lure victims into their schemes. This can include fake promises which appeal to one's desires. The primary force at play is propaganda, but not solely the external kind promising a hefty payoff. I'm addressing the internal propaganda. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Of the many different ways the narcissist is described, today I want to focus on the grandiose sense of self. Have you ever slowed down to think, what is it like for them to live in a grandiose world? On the surface, you might think this is a blissful place to reside. Who wouldn't enjoy being filled with omnipotence? However, this perspective only scratches the surface of understanding grandiosity and omnipotence. Narcissistic grandiosity can manifest in various ways, depending on the individual and the specific cluster or type of narcissism. Some common ways that it presents itself are well known: exaggerated sense of self-importance, arrogance, fantasies of success, power, or beauty, a need for admiration, just to name a few. Another way that grandiosity presents itself, often overlooked in social media content, is through what's often referred to in my field, the field of psychoanalysis, as intolerable suffering. Picture this: you or someone you know complains of intolerable suffering. Maybe you're tormented by your partner or someone close to you, perhaps a best friend or a parent. You constantly feel humiliated and judged by them. And in general, you have a feeling that most people don't treat you in such a nice way. This may be the more challenging aspect to grasp, but I encourage you to approach it with an open mind. Some of these judgments stem from within you. We're aware that projection is a common trait amongst narcissists, and herein lies a form of projection. In other words, it doesn't occur to them that they may be the one who is judging, that they are judging themselves or others. It just feels to them like they are constantly being judged or criticized. You might be convinced that someone in your life truly embodies judgment and criticism. What I'm suggesting is these feelings are coming from you, meaning these are your thoughts and feelings. Because you feel judged doesn't necessarily mean that someone is judging you. In other words, that could be a feeling, but doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. However, let's say that it's true, that you do have somebody in your life who tends to be critical and judging. Even if that's the case, and this is an important person in your life, then we must question why it's deemed necessary to retain this judgmental and critical voice. In other words, why is it important to keep this voice in your life? One reason you may keep this voice around is you have told yourself, perhaps someday I will get it right. In other words, it's possible that one becomes seduced and captivated by, and I quote, the promise of grandiosity. It's the promise of perfection, that someday you'll get it right. And in this example, the relationship, let's say, will, in your mind, be perfect. However, this is the incredibly tragic part, is anything good or anything that your partner or your parent, whoever, whatever they have to offer that is of value, oftentimes gets rejected. In the narcissistic mindset, acknowledging or accepting anything good offered by others can be perceived as a threat to one's inflated self-image. Let me say that differently. To accept something good acknowledges the quote unquote need to have been helped or enriched in some way. And if you can acknowledge that, then you must say to yourself also that someone had something that you did not have. This something good may simply be a helpful opinion, pointing out something you did not see. Now, I'm going to return to this because this is a really important point, and I'm going to get back to it when I discuss the timeshare scam in a moment. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is anything that's good needs to be rejected for one's own narcissistic reasons. By devaluing or attacking the positive contributions of others, you can maintain the illusion of superiority, right? Because again, you didn't need anything from anybody. It's like, I got this covered. In a world where need and dependence are scorned, the rejection and attack on anything valuable leaves one in a loveless, cruel, and narrow existence. And again, just bear with me. I'm going to give an example of this in case it's not clear. But what I'm trying to get at here is when I say narrow existence, is the world becomes narrowed indeed, and the grandiosity takes over your mind. You can no longer see reality clearly because the only thing you see is this need for perfection. Let me illustrate this concept of intolerable suffering, narrow-mindedness, and the hope that someday I will get it right and everything will be perfect. Recently, I heard about a massive scam targeting older adults who own timeshare properties. This story is not just about the victims who lost everything. In my mind, this is also a story about precisely what we're discussing today. This is a story, I believe, about an aspect of oneself, a structure in the mind of the grandiose narcissist that quote unquote promises salvation at the cost of perverting the perception of reality. Let's turn to this scam to illustrate what I'm trying to describe. What do most scams have in common? Scam is often used, I quote, deceptive tactics. I'm quoting this because I'm going to come back to it in a moment, just like the word promises. So scammers use deceptive tactics to do what? To lure victims into their schemes. This can include fake promises which appeal to one's desires. The primary force at play is propaganda, but not solely the external kind promising a hefty payoff. I'm addressing the internal propaganda. Again, we're thinking about the grandiose sense of self and this structure in one's mind. And what I'm getting at is it pumps out what I'm calling internal propaganda. And this internal propaganda is a constant companion to the grandiose narcissist. In other words, it's always there. It's a tantalizing promise. Engage in this scheme, and you'll ascend to a state of divine power. The appeal of triumphant victory or being, and I quote, special looms large, assuring you that you'll outsmart even the scammers themselves. However, such beliefs often lead into a delusional state of mind. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating by using the word delusional, listen to an interview with someone who's been scammed out of their total life savings and borrowed money too, despite being told by loved ones that they were being scammed. Remember, a moment ago, I said I would return to this point, and here it is. To accept something good acknowledges the need to have been helped or enriched. Just pointing out something, I said this earlier, just pointing out something that you did not see has to be rejected. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here, is that even for someone who's getting scammed and being told by loved ones, this is a scam, you can't see it. It's rejected. You don't want to hear it. You can't take in anything good like that, because to take in something good means to admit to yourself that you don't know. You overlook something. In an interview, one victim of the timeshare scam revealed that it took him some time to come to terms with being scammed. He admitted that for about a year, he found himself unable to resist answering the scammer's calls, even though each time he picked up that phone, it led to him giving away more of his own hard-earned money, giving away his whole retirement savings. He explained that it took a while to accept it because deep down, he realized he was more stubborn than he thought. In terms of grandiosity, we can speculate that admitting he was wrong or was fooled challenged his grandiose self-image and his conviction of omnipotence. He couldn't admit, so he couldn't do two things. He couldn't accept anything of value. That was the advice or the reality that he was being scammed. And then he couldn't admit that he did anything wrong, because the narcissist doesn't do anything wrong. Once he admitted this, he reported that he now has a huge streak of anger in him toward the perpetrators, and he can't let it go. And by the way, just as an aside, if you listen to my recent podcast, I differentiate between anger, rage, and hatred. And then you could tell me, do you think that this was really anger that this fellow had? The fact that he could not let this go usually is an indication that this is much more than anger. The emotional shift that he was describing from this hopeful state of mind that he was going to be victorious to now being full of anger, this has been well documented in the psychoanalytic literature. And this is something I see in my own practice with this kind of individual. It's known as the second stage of this delusional structure. The delusional structure, don't forget, is supported by the whole grandiose sense of self. And that's why I'm saying, and I should have said this earlier, living with the grandiosity, living with the grandiose sense of self is not easy. This is a very painful endeavor. So the second stage of the delusional structure of the grandiose sense of self, where greatness and divinity turn into negativity and destructiveness, is what we're beginning to see. This is what he's describing. However, the grandiosity is still present, even though we're in this second stage. So the work must still focus on addressing this internal omnipotent structure. It just shifts now to how he can annihilate the people who scammed him. In other words, you see, he's still grandiose, and now he has all the power. And by the way, this is also what we would call a defense, right? He's no longer weak or powerless or victimized. Now in this angry streak, he's the dominant one who's in control. But as long as we know that we're working with the grandiose structure, there's hope. In my practice, the way I work with these individuals is to demonstrate to them how they are in a loveless exile with no contact or comfort. In other words, that's what I mentioned earlier, the part about how they reject any offer of help. That's the kind of stuff that we begin to expose them to. We show them this. We look at how they cannot accept the support from family members or friends, such as those who were telling him this is a scam. Admitting he was fooled was painfully difficult because it entails giving up the promise, giving up the hope of what? You could fill in the gap here. This is where it's always a little bit different, but of being special, wealthy, because in the scam, he already bought into this idea that there's going to be a lucrative payoff. That's oftentimes how people get scammed. It's the promise of wealth. What else does he have to give up? maybe a feeling that he's unique. Whatever it is, again, you could fill in the gap. He gives up a sense of greatness, superiority, or some kind of triumph over the scammers. In short, the main task is to enable them to see, appreciate, and make use of a richer, understanding, loving world, which, by the way, is the only experience that can rescue them from the intolerable suffering that the grandiose sense of self inflicts on them. What do you think about this perspective on grandiosity? At the very least, I hope this perspective helps you begin to question and think about narcissistic grandiosity in a new way. I hope my explanation and the comparison to being scammed offered another angle to understand what it's like for someone to live under the constant pressure that the grandiose sense of self puts on individuals with this narcissistic characteristic. One last point. What I also hope that I emphasized was a very different way to start thinking about the people in your life who may have these kinds of narcissistic characteristics, and to suggest that it's not easy. It's not easy to live under the influence, the pressure that I mentioned a moment ago that's constantly placed on these individuals. Look, anyway, we have to stop there for today. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me directly. But until next time, engage your mind, not your grandiosity. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.